there were two samples that were brought to my attention. These two samples were directly correlated with aircraft activity prior to the collection. In one case, the samples were seen falling from the sky. The first sample occurred in eastern Oregon, and the second in the Sacramento area. Two separate parties at two separate times were, let's say, affected enough by the appearance of this material on the ground and or in the air to collect it. And looking for a place to send to, they became familiar with my name as a research person in this field. So at the end of November, I was the recipient of two samples from two separate parties from two separate locations at two separate times. Neither of these parties knew one another and still don't, to my knowledge. I began an analysis of that material at that time and was immediately, let's say, struck by some unusual qualities or characteristics of that material. These characteristics are best summarized by describing the size of this material. The material is composed of fibers. It's a fibrous material, white in nature. And I was struck to put this material under a microscope as soon as possible. And the most, let's say, the most prominent characteristic which shows up immediately is the size of these fibers. These fibers are incredibly small. I have eventually had them measured as being less than 1 micron in width. 1 micron is an astounding number. To give the audience a frame of reference or a comparison, a human hair is roughly in the neighborhood of 60 to 80 microns in thickness. A line of cotton thread, is roughly 10 microns in thickness, and a spider web is approximately 7 microns in width, at least the ones I have measured. The material I am speaking of is less than 1 micron in width. There are little to no fibers, of my knowledge, natural fibers of this size. Asbestos might be the nearest candidate, which should be in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 microns thick. So the size of this material, thickness of it, is certainly an unusual characteristic which warrants further investigation. A second characteristic of this material is that it is extremely adhesive. It's very difficult to separate contact with the material once it is made. If you're using a microscope slide and a needle, it would often take 2 to 3 passes to get this fiber to adhere to a glass slide. And a third characteristic would be what would best be described as a synthetic nature having a wavy form. And this is a microscopically wavy form, something that you cannot see with your eye. But I describe it as kinky or wavy in nature at a microscopic level. So these are 3 physical characteristics which appeared, which separated this material as being unique and, let's say, warranting further investigation. I hope that helps with the first part of your question.
Right, it does.
In terms of a physical form. And I would like to say, in casual passing, that what we're speaking of here is not something of a speculative nature. This is not something that needs to be wondering whether or not it's occurring or not. This is a tangible phenomenon which all listeners within the United States can observe. In terms of the appearance of these trails, this is not something imaginary. The physical material, of course, is certainly of a more rare nature. But this is something, I'm a scientist by background, and I use those methods, and they can apply here. The second part of your question in respect to health issues, we can only, let's say, look for correlations and patterns in the world around us, and one of those patterns which is appearing is the frequency and incidence of illness across the nation associated with this aerial activity. And it is worthwhile to investigate the official sources of information on illness reported on a regular basis, actually weekly or biweekly, by the Centers for Disease Control.
Right.
And that agency reports on a regular basis the frequency of what is called influenza. And what's interesting is the terms describing illness have now generalized themselves and become more generic and broadened themselves. And we frequently note the inclusion of the term flu-like illness now in these, let's say, categorizations. And the CDC reports statistics on the frequency and incidence of influenza and flu-like illness across the United States on a regular basis. What is of much interest on the numbers of these reports is that really for the majority of 1999, the American populace was at an epidemic, what is classified as an epidemic level, which starts around 8%, somewhere around 8% of the population being admitted formally into a hospital or a doctor's office with this, let's say, diagnosis of influenza or flu-type illness.
Okay.
A epidemic level has sustained itself for a majority of 1999. In the year 2000, the current year, it's especially fascinating because once again, we are at epidemic levels on a continuous basis, and that 8% has jumped to a 12%. A percentage point on a national basis is a huge number in terms of magnitude of people that are affected. If a person looks at the charts for this, and I have a link to that on the website, it's really astronomical in terms of the way that this is deviating for the current year. What is even of further interest is that of that percentage of people, by the way, these are people that die. This is the mortality rate. What
Right.
it's saying is of those people that are admitted to the hospital with influenza or the generic flu-type illness term, let's say 8% of those people die. That's what the number refers to. And so that jump is from 8 to 12%.
That's quite a few people, too, on a national scale.
It's astronomical in terms of its implication, in terms of numbers of people that is basically unreported in the news. And what is of further interest is that of the people that are dying, the numbers are showing that literally 1%, a very small percent of the people are actually dying from influenza. What this means is that the majority of people that are reported as dying are dying from an illness which is falling under a generic term of flu-like. That's actually the fascinating statistic that is now emerging as one studies this data.
Makes you wonder what they're doing.
Right, and what exactly the term means.
Exactly.
And the appearance. If readers just become observant, first of all, you observe the sky and then listen. Notice the inclusion and appearance of broad-based use of the term flu-like illness.
Right. Okay, we're taking another break, so hold that thought. We'll get back to that, too, when we come back to that flu-like illness and what that means or what that potentially might mean with this data that my guest, Clifford Carnicom, is collecting. Is Clifford Carnicom and Dave Peterson. We're talking about chemtrails. Now, this is a very interesting and very serious subject because from what we are hearing from Clifford tonight, data has been collected that indicates that there is a biological agent involved in all of this. And, of course, we are he's basically collecting the evidence, and he's going to be soliciting for assistance in helping to analyze this data in hopes of trying to identify exactly what it is that's coming out of the sky that may be coming from the output of jets. And what those jets are, we don't know. We've got a pretty good idea from his documentation and stuff. And again, the website is www.carnicom.com. That's CARNICOM.com. And I invite you to go to that website while we're talking tonight so you can see the thing that's going on here. Clifford, what I'd like to do is pick up on this segment now, and let's talk about the biological components that have been identified in these samples that have been collected.
Sure, Michael. I'd like to mention, if I can,
Sure,
that I have no desire or any goal to fabricate anything. I'm actually only seek the truth on this issue and to have information fully disclosed to the American public.
right.
In an effort to continue that purpose, at the time that I analyzed these materials, let's say it was found difficult to have that material analyzed professionally by anyone.
Uh-huh.
We actually did have involvement with one laboratory in the southwestern United States that delivered results which were very easily proven to be false for anyone even slightly knowledgeable in chemical or analysis techniques. And so that was one of the first flags that came up, was that there were some difficult